All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We are so excited to have you as a part of this session. My name is Adrienne Sum, and I'm the General Counsel here at Quizlet, covering the legal function and the trust and safety function. And I'm joined by my colleague, Crystal Braswell, who is Quizlet's Head of Communications. And we are very excited to introduce to you a special project that Quizlet has been working on to create a new resource for you and for students. Before we dive in, though, I'd like to thank Quizlet team members Will and Aaliyah. You can see their little tiles at the top. Who have put a ton of work into this session and are helping out right at this very moment to keep the slides moving smoothly, Q&A going smoothly, making Crystal and I look good. So thank you, Will and Aaliyah. Now, while I have this opportunity, because this doesn't happen very often, I just want to take this chance to offer an additional heartfelt thank you to each of you as teachers, administrators, supporters of students, champions of education, for everything that you do, pandemic or no. We are all indebted to you for your work. So thank you. So why don't we move to the next slide, please? Today, Crystal and I are very excited to introduce to you a new and evolving resource that we are calling the Modern Learning Lab. Now, it's second nature for Quizlet to think about how we build great tools for learning and to dive into the learning science. But as the pandemic has reminded us time and again, and keeps reminding us, there is so much more that goes into effective, positive learning than just the tools that we use in this new, dare I say, modern learning era. So to go beyond just providing tools for learning, we wanted to build a platform for everyone with a stake in learning to share experiences, start conversations, explore research, and ultimately drive new insights. So if we go to the next slide, if you visit the Modern Learning Lab today, you will see that an area of focus is academic integrity. Now, academic integrity and what it means, how to support it, how to promote it, and more, how to enforce it, has become an increasingly important topic in the last few years. At Quizlet, we start with a firm belief in students' ability to learn with grit and integrity. And it is our mission to make students unstoppable by helping them practice and master their material honestly. That's also why we want to support candid conversations about academic integrity and what's fair or appropriate in an online world. So in this section, we hope to spotlight lessons from your perspectives, students' perspectives, the latest in academic integrity research, and learnings from our own platform. So as an example of bringing you useful, actionable information backed by research, we've published a piece in the academic integrity section that looks like the next slide. Thanks. So right now it's the summer. You're probably gearing up for your next term. You're putting the polishing touches on your course design. We hope that this article will provide you with useful tips for nurturing academic integrity, or even just food for thought. Now, there is an ocean of research out there, and we've barely scratched the surface. But there were 3 strategies that we thought were useful to highlight. The first one involves shifting students' mindsets by asking them about their needs and preferences so that they feel bought into a class's policies. Many of you may be familiar with Professor David Redinger through his work with the International Center of Academic Integrity. He theorized that if a student thinks that their school doesn't support them or their teacher doesn't understand what they're going through, they might be more likely to rationalize breaking with their school or their class policies. So to combat this kind of thinking, he gave his students a survey at the beginning of the year to ask them about their preferences for the class, their concerns about the class, and even their limitations. Questions like, did they have reliable internet? Did they need a recording of the class after the lecture? So obviously he couldn't take in every specific piece of feedback and overhaul his course design to meet every single request, but he was able to make his students feel heard and that their concerns were respected. And his belief was that by demonstrating to students that he valued their input and that they were a part of the process to set class policies, he could get them to think twice about going offside of those policies because they had a role in shaping them. So this was a neat, lightweight way to get student buy-in to class policies. Another technique that we cover in this article is one that you might already be using for big assignments, and it's scaffolding, breaking up large assignments into distinct processes with staggered due dates. It's great for teaching students about time management, project management, goal setting, and ideally it allows a student to deliver their best work. But the exciting thing is that scaffolding also has benefits for promoting academic integrity as well, because it deals with that situational aspect of some forms of cheating. The classic situation where a student has left everything for the last minute, is panicking, and is thinking about ways to cut corners so that they can still turn something in. So the beauty of scaffolding is that it helps to ideally prevent some of those situations. And even better, it gives you as an educator the opportunity to intervene, to provide support and guidance to a student much earlier in the process, which probably has the most influence on getting students to a situation where they won't feel like they're panicking and that they need to cut corners. Lastly, we also wanted to touch upon the more formal policy aspect of promoting academic integrity. I'm sure you don't need to hear from me, but there's been so much change in the way that teachers have been asked to teach. You had to go remote all of a sudden. You've had to go back to class all of a sudden. There's been hybrid modes of teaching as well. And as you've shifted back and forth and tried different ways of teaching, adapting your academic integrity policy to flex to each of those changes may not have been at the top of your priority list. We actually found an interesting survey of 41 universities in Australia, where of those 41 schools, only 5 of them mentioned online assessments in their academic integrity policy, and none of them distinguished between how student conduct might be expected to be different between an online or in-person assessment. And those kinds of gaps can actually lead to confusion for students. We do a decent amount of user research. We talk to students quite frequently. One student told us about a situation where she was assigned a remote exam, and she was told that it was open to notes, textbooks, self-study created materials, but closed to Google. Now, she had actually created, through genuine effort, a study guide for herself using Google Docs that had links to web articles. And so she wasn't sure if this qualified as a self-created study material or if it broke the policy on not using Google. So as you go into your next term, consider whether the way that you teach now, which has had to shift so rapidly in the last 2 years, still matches the academic integrity policy or the class quality policies that you have, as a way to ensure that students truly understand what your expectations are. Now, this summary research article is just a small step in what we would like to do with the academic integrity section of the Modern Learning Lab. The most important thing for us is to actually hear from you about what are the things that you are most interested in reading about. What are the topics that would cover what's real to you in your classrooms? What works, what doesn't? We can't do this without you. And so we would love to have you join our conversation, maybe even contribute to a future piece, in which case, sorry, Ellie, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, we would love to hear from you, and you can reach out to us at modernlearning@quizlet.com. Now, as we know, students are incredibly stressed right now, and the pandemic created a whole new list of stressors. So student well-being has become an increasingly important topic as well. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Crystal now, who will share more about how we're using the Modern Learning Lab to support conversations around mental health and wellness for students.
Thanks, Adrienne. Before I get started, I want to encourage anyone that has questions to go ahead and start dropping them into the Q&A section at the bottom. We should have plenty of time at the end of the session to go through some questions and hear some of your suggestions as well. So with that, as Adrienne mentioned, we created the Modern Learning Lab to serve as a resource for you and your students. We know that just as academic integrity is top of mind for you, so is the health and well-being of your students. So we set out to create our content strategy for this pillar. And as a reminder, there are 3 key pillars of content that you'll see on the Modern Learning Lab. So there's academic integrity, which Adrienne just went over. There's mental health and wellness, which I'll spend the next few minutes talking about. And there are study tips and best practices that we'll get into as well. But for this pillar in particular, we knew we first needed to make sure we understood where students are when it comes to mental health and the things that are impacting them most. So the last few years have taken their toll on all of us. And while there's consistent data available around the impact of the social and educational development of younger students, we saw a real gap in information and focus on older student audiences. So back in April, We decided to commission an international survey across the US, UK, and Germany to get a better idea of how Gen Z was doing when it came to mental health and its impact on their well-being and their academic success. The next couple of minutes, I'm really going to focus on the results that we saw from the UK and US specifically. But we knew a few things to be true. So on the macro level, the weight of the world felt particularly heavy in that moment. A grim climate change report had just been issued in the UK, Russia had just invaded Ukraine, and another COVID variant was quickly making its way around the world. Meanwhile, at school, many students were still adjusting to another change in schedule. And for some, that might have been a new version of hybrid and adjustments to that schedule. For others, it might have been a return to in-person. But we knew that regardless of which year they were in, within weeks, many students would be buckling down, preparing for end-of-year exams, and others would be basically on the hunt for their first job or internship. And regardless of how many years it's been since you've been in school, I think we can all remember kind of the anxiety and the stress and the uncertainty that comes with that period of life. So we weren't sure what that would all mean when it came to the overall state of student mental health. And we expected that any one of those things could indeed rise to the top as a top issue for students. Next slide, please. So we set out to learn a few things. We wanted to know how the state of the 18-plus-year-old student improved in the last year. What would they identify as their greatest source of stress, and what impact had it had on their lives, both inside of school and out? And do they have the resources and support they need to manage the challenges they face? And I'll be honest, there's a lot of data that we got from this survey. We're going to go through just scratch the surface level of it. But we were still surprised by what we saw. Next slide. So first off, we saw that 43% of respondents described their mental health this last school year as better than the prior school year. So that's the 2021-22 school year compared to the 2020-2021 school year. And while that's positive, a full 32% said their mental health had actually gotten worse. And what's more, 34% of respondents that were graduate or postgraduate students said that it was worse this year than last. And we know in-person schooling is helpful to reconnect with friends and teachers, but it also became clear that additional resources needed to be put in place to support students as they navigated their academic journeys. When we asked about in-person versus online schooling, we saw that 87% of students who were in an online format felt like mental health challenges impacted the quality of their schoolwork. And that's compared to 76% of students who were completely back in in-person formats saying the same. Now, that still is a really high percentage, but you can see the shift in the level of impact depending on whether they are still doing remote learning or they move to in-person. Next slide, please. So mental health and support for students is a deep and complex issue, but we wanted to shed more light on what students, especially high school and college students, are experiencing, because we've seen the direct correlation between schoolwork and anxiety and stress. And our survey showed that as well. Excuse me. Of the 2,000 respondents from the US and the UK, the top stressor for Gen Z was final exams and end of semester grades. And 49% of respondents identified that as being one of the top sources. That was followed by balancing personal lives and hobbies with schoolwork at 47%. And of those who said that final exams and end of semester grades are currently impacting their mental health, 1 in 5 actually said it is the top source of stress in their lives. So I said earlier, we were a little bit surprised by the results with everything going on in the world. I'll be honest, we anticipated that any one of those other things might have, there's a decent case for it making the top spot as a #1 stressor, but it came back to studies, anxiety around exam prep and end of year, followed by some of these more kind of day-to-day life issues. So both students in the US and the UK cited final exams and end of semester grades and balancing personal life with schoolwork as a source of stress in their lives. However, the next most frequently cited stressor was personal relationships in the US. 49% of respondents said that, and finances in the UK, and that was 41% of students identified that as one of their top stressors. Now, when it came to seeking help for the issues they faced, respondents shared that free access to mental health screenings and therapy and greater academic support, such as the option for virtual lectures or relaxed timing on assignment deadlines, would be most helpful in managing their mental health and or that of their peers. But it's worth noting also that 49% of students said their school does offer mental health or emotional health support, and they've just not taken advantage of it at this point. And the data does give us some clue as to why that might be. So top reasons include the fear of admitting they need help, finding someone they trust, and accessing affordable services. And I think those reasons are really relatable, whether you're a student or not. There's, that place that you've got to get to where you're willing to open yourself up. And then you need to be able to find the resources. And if they're easily accessible, it's that much easier to dive in. So with that in mind, our goal at Quizlet is to actually work with partners and teachers like yourselves to create and evolve resources that can help students by meeting them in their needs where they're at now. And that brings me back to where we're planning to start with the Modern Learning Lab. Next slide, please. So at launch, students will find content that focuses on well-being, from tips to help manage the stress associated with exam prep and pointers on how to access mental health resources at school, to insights on the relationships between mental health and studying. And in the months that follow, we'll be creating new content and hosting content from partner organizations like the JED Foundation. For those of you who may not be familiar, the JED Foundation is a nonprofit that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for teens and young adults. And we're working with them to provide actionable insights for students looking to support their mental well-being. We'll share a link to this that lives on the Modern Learning Lab, but our friends at JED also gave us a few actionable tips that we wanted to share with you today and for you to keep in mind as you're navigating this topic with your students. Next slide, please. Okay, first off, one of the first tips that they gave us is to share mental health resources. If your school offers a wellness center, or free counseling sessions, or yoga or meditation, whatever it may be, make sure that you're sharing that information with your students. And like we mentioned, nearly half of Gen Z students haven't utilized the mental health support from their school, and teachers can have a big impact on that changing. The second, it's probably no surprise that social media can affect our day-to-day, but it's important to remember it can affect our mental health as well. So JED reminded us to think about how we feel after being on social media. Does the time spent make us feel energized or depleted? And it's important to take breaks from or stop using apps or activities that bring us down. And while this is obviously a piece of advice that they're offering for students, it's also something that I think we can all probably take to heart and remind ourselves of. But we should be reminding our friends and our students to take breaks, put their phones down, and connect with the people that they love in person. And lastly, this is a big one, is sleep. It's no surprise that students stay up late to study, sometimes play video games, or just scroll through social media. But we should remind each other and our students that a good night's sleep is better than cramming for an exam or being exhausted the next day. So we will continue to work with JED Foundation this semester and beyond to bring additional resources to the Modern Learning Lab around student mental health. Next slide, please. Okay, and since we know that school and studying is such a driving force of stress, we also want to ensure we're providing a holistic place for resources around study tips as well. So that brings us to our third and final content category of the Modern Learning Lab, study resources. In addition to content around academic integrity and mental health, we're also going to be sharing study tips related resources from students, from teachers like yourselves, and from Quizlet staff. Next slide, please. So this is one example of the pieces you'll see from our colleague Anna, who's a learning and data scientist here at Quizlet. She also has a PhD in learning science, so I think she knows a thing or two about this space. And you might have even heard her session last year, but she offers some incredible insights into better understanding how students, especially Gen Z, are learning. And she shared some characteristics of Gen Z that I thought would be helpful to share here as we're thinking about their studying and learning habits in addition to their mental health. First, they're true digital natives. They've never known a time without widespread internet access, so they're comfortable absorbing information online. And in fact, 96% of those over the age of 18 own smartphones, probably not surprising for those of you who are sitting in classrooms with students day in and day out. Secondly, they're devoted to individuality, and they place a really high value on independence, adaptability, and self-expression. So they're well positioned to own their education and their experience as self-learners. Lastly, they're realistic. So they make pragmatic, analytic lifestyle choices and are continuously evolving their personal definition of success. And aside from these common values, our observations of patterns within Quizlet's data have shown some marked learning differences among our students. Some of these patterns indicate strikingly driven habits that suggest a strong sense of ownership towards learning, and other patterns indicate what we call last-minute learning. So students using the platform to cram for tests or pull together materials for an all-night session. Understanding these differences, we want to provide tools that give students more choices about how they learn wherever possible. And I definitely recommend checking out the study tips section to the Modern Learning Lab for more insights on how you can better understand the students in your class. Next slide, please. So our overall goal with the Modern Learning Lab is to highlight not only the study tips and the importance of academic integrity and mental health, but to open it up to create a bigger conversation as well. And we want to talk about the why behind students feeling the way they do, what's affecting them, some of the choices that they make, and get a better sense of what we can do to create the best learning environment possible for them. So we hope this is a conversation that will continue not only here, but in your classrooms at home. And we hope the Modern Learning Lab becomes a helpful resource for you and a source of support for your students. With your help, we will continue to evolve the content that you see here and the types of resources available. And so we want to take a moment to open it up in, let's do this in chat, open it up to get some of your thoughts on what you've seen across academic integrity, what you've seen across mental health, and some of these study resources. Is there additional content that you think would be helpful for you, for your students, for your parents of your students? Are there ideas for content that you have that you yourself would love to contribute? Because we would love to hear from you and make this an interactive site and tool. We recognize we are not the end-all be-all experts in this space. And so we want to really create room for partners, for teachers, for students who are also living this day in and day out to share their perspectives, share their voices, and help one another as well. So we'd love to take a moment. If you've got some thoughts, ideas that you want to share in the chat, please drop them in there now. And we'll go to the next slide and start Q&A here in just a minute. I'm seeing some comments, students do not sleep enough. And somebody wasn't seeing any slides. Actually, I'm just seeing that now. Has everybody else been able to see slides, or has that been an issue for everyone? Okay, other folks have been able to see slides. Do study tips help last minute students with their learning? Other folks can see. All right, I had planned to read some of this, but you all are throwing ideas in so quickly, which is amazing. It might take me a minute to catch up. Let me scroll back up here. Organizer formats and templates to help students and teachers with scaffolding and organizing materials for studying. That's a great call out. More resources on how to help students with emotional and behavioral disorders. That's a great call out as well. Students dividing and conquering rather than doing their own work has contributed to a lack of understanding of a broader picture. Okay. I'm going to scroll back up here for a second.
And while Crystal is looking through those, I do see some really interesting comments on the topic of academic integrity. And I love how folks are touching on the multifaceted element of academic integrity. There's the element of the student's intrinsic motivation. There are the formal policies that you have in the class. And so, yes, these are absolutely topics that we want to dive into further. So thank you for these comments.
With that, let's jump into Q&A. I'll kick it back over to you, Adrienne.
Okay. So our first question is the Modern Learning Lab something I can use in my upper elementary class, or is it more geared to secondary school? So Crystal, I'll let you cover it from the topics that you were covering. At the end of the day, academic integrity is something that we hope students believe in and live throughout their entire academic career. So we certainly hope that the material in the academic integrity section will be useful to teachers of all levels of schooling. Crystal?
Yeah, I would second that. I think, we've mentioned this a couple of times over the discussion. The idea here is this really is an evolving resource. And so you can click on, follow the QR codes. You'll get a sense for the content that's there now. Just keep in mind that we are just now launching this. And so while some of the content might be geared towards high school students or university students, as we continue to expand, I could see that audience definitely broadening.
Great. Thank you. Another question for you, Crystal. Is there content-specific information as it relates to mental health? I am thinking of my students who have literal panic attacks in class stemming from a math phobia.
I understand math phobia as a communications professional. Yeah, this is where the content from our partners like Jeb Foundation, I think, is going to come into play. So they have quite a few partners, employees, academics that they work with to create content and resources that are really intended to help address specific concerns and issues and challenges that students face. So we've just kicked off this relationship with them. I think in the months ahead, you'll see additional partnerships and additional experts that we bring on board. But that is the type of content that's really helpful. One, just from your perspective, to hear the feedback of that kind of layer of specificity. Bad word to try to use when I can never get it out. That's what we ideally want to see on the site. So again, as we continue to evolve that content, our hope is that you'll see content that's applicable for students, applicable for educators, applicable for parents, and that addresses the different types of circumstances and stressors that each audience faces in this current learning environment that we're in.
That makes sense. Thank you. Question that I will go ahead and take quickly. Is the Learning Lab only available in the teacher version? No, actually, it is available via these QR codes to anybody who wants to check them out. And so we definitely encourage you to take a look. Have your students take a look as well. We absolutely want to know what they think about the content that's there, because it really should serve both students and teachers. And feel free to also send us any of your thoughts through the right-hand QR code, which is our email handle. Okay, so one question or statement in question. I am amazed at how quickly Gen Z were able to jump into using technology. Organization seems to be what they struggle with. Any suggestions on organizing for study skills? That is a great question, and I really wish Anna Kay was here on the panel with us. Now, we intend to keep building out content in each of the three sections, and so this would definitely fall within the study tips section. We will share this with her to see if we can encourage her to produce content that will be useful for this question. Thank you. And then I think we maybe have time for one or two last questions. What suggestions can the panel share about getting high school age students to disconnect from their phones and connect with the students who are there with them in person, especially if they don't know them already? I have a homeroom class, and this was a big challenge since we returned to in-person learning. Any ideas? You know, that is a great question. Frankly, sometimes you have to pry my devices from my sweaty little hands. What's been interesting is actually and teachers will know better than I, because my kids are not quite yet high schoolers, there seems to be almost an exhaustion now from screens. And students are actually wanting to be put in front of screens less often, whether it's in school or even outside of the classroom. And so I think finding ways to tap into that internal motivation not to be in front of a screen is something that we can all lean into. But thank you. This is a good area of research for us that we can dive into further. Anything you want to add on that, Crystal?
I mean, I think I certainly can't comment from a classroom standpoint, but it's a challenge for many of us sitting in meetings day in and day out as well, whether you're in person or virtual. And sometimes I think what I've seen help in group sessions is to get folks up and move people around. And so that might mean at the start of a class, at the end of a class, in the middle of a class, seeing if there's a way to shake things up a little bit and getting students to engage with one another. It is, like Adrienne said, so hard to pry the phones away, but little surprise icebreakers, conversation points where everybody needs to be dialed in tend to help. Now, different audience, but it is one of my favorite forcing functions when it comes to getting everybody to take their eyes off the screen.
Yep. Or as one teacher has helpfully suggested, Faraday bags. Those are the bags that you put your phone in and then none of the signals come in and out. That's probably also another way to do it. I see though that we are at time. And so Thank you so much for all of the amazing suggestions in the chat window. Please keep it coming through modernlearning@quizlet.com. We absolutely want this to be a valuable resource to you. And so knowing what is important to you is exactly what we need.
And like last note, I'll say again, if you're interested in contributing content, if you have experts you think we should be talking to, please reach out to us. We want to hear from you.
Thanks everyone for your time
Thanks
today.
all.